Welcome to the Forged Over 40 podcast. My name is Steve Didier, and this show is for high performers who refuse to let their edge quietly erode. If you built companies, led teams, carried responsibility for decades, but lately your focus feels duller, decisions feel heavier, and your mental stamina isn't quite what it used to be, this is where we rebuild the biological systems that your leadership depends on. And we do it on a physiological level. So let's get something straight right out of the gate. Mental sharpness is not a personality trait. It is not discipline. It is not productivity software. It is not a better morning routine. It is biology. And most CEOs are unknowingly degrading the very systems that give them their edge. You think you're optimizing, but you're stacking stressors. You think you're staying sharp, you're overstimulating dopamine. You think you're resilient, you're numbing fatigue with caffeine and convincing yourself you're fine. Those things work at 35. They do not work at 50. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Cognitive decline in high performers rarely happens in a dramatic crash. It happens very subtly. You start rereading emails twice. You delay small decisions. You feel slightly overwhelmed by a complexity that used to excite you. Your patience shortens, your creativity narrows, and your tolerance for friction drops. You still perform, but you don't dominate. And that gap is not aging. It is physiology drifting out of alignment. Chronic stress rewires the executive brain. And let's talk about what that actually means. Your prefrontal cortex is responsible for strategic thinking, impulse control, long-term planning, and complex decision-making. Basically, it's the CEO of your brain. It is also highly sensitive to stress hormones. When cortisol remains elevated for months or years, the brain shifts resources towards survival circuitry, the amygdala and threat detection pathways, and they switch it away from executive control. In simple terms, you become more reactive and less strategic. You feel busy but less clear. You're operating but not optimizing. And that's dangerous when people, capital, and long-term direction depend on your cognition. So let's bring dopamine into the picture. Dopamine is not pleasure. It is motivation, drive, anticipation, and reward signaling. High performers run hot on dopamine. But chronic stress, constant stimulation, caffeine, social media, and rapid decision cycles desensitize dopamine receptors over time. You don't lose ambition. You lose sensitivity. So you push harder, more coffee, more output, more stimulation. And the baseline keeps dropping. That's how leaders slowly blunt their own edge. Now let's add mitochondria to the equation. Your brain is an energy hog. It represents about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of your energy. If mitochondrial output declines from chronic stress, poor sleep, blood sugar instability, inflammation, or hormone shifts, your cognitive endurance drops first. Not your biceps, not your visible health, your mental stamina. And this is why some executives can still look really fit, still train, still show up, but feel mentally taxed by 3 p.m. They don't have a mindset problem. They have an energy systems problem. And this is where I'm going to be very direct. The productivity world has no idea what to do with this. They tell you to time block. They tell you to journal. They tell you wake up at 4:30 a.m. They tell you to cold plunge and meditate harder. None, and I do mean none of that, fixes mitochondrial output. None of that stabilizes cortisol rhythm. None of that just restores dopamine sensitivity. It just layers more pressure onto an already overloaded system. And the biohacker crowd, they're really not much better. They throw supplements at systems. They stack nootropics. They chase marginal gains. But if your nervous system is dysregulated and your hormonal signaling is drifting, you cannot supplement your way into sustained executive sharpness. This is why the assess method starts where it does. Analyze, stabilize, support, energize, stress regulate, and sustain. But it starts with analyze. Most people try and jump straight to energize. That's like revving an engine with no oil in it. If you want to sustain mental sharpness into your 50s, 60s, and beyond, you've got to treat your brain like the high-performance organ it is. You protect its fuel supply. You regulate its stress load. You stabilize its hormone signaling. And you rebuild mitochondrial density. You also maintain insulin sensitivity so glucose delivery to the brain is clean and stable. Look, at 54, I outperform most men 25 years younger than me in training, focus, and recovery. Not because I'm special, but because I stopped abusing my system. I used to run hot, volume, intensity, push, grind. And that works. It builds bodies, it builds businesses. Until one day, it slowly slows down. Now, I still train like a savage, but I train intelligently. I monitor recovery. I manage volume. I respect nervous system tone. I support hormone balance with deep labs and not guesswork. The result? Strength, clarity, energy. Not because I defied aging, but because I optimized physiology, which appears on the outside to be defying aging. If you're leading at a high level, mental sharpness is not optional. It is the asset. If you don't protect it deliberately, it will erode. Next, I want to go a little deeper into exactly what chronic stress does to the executive brain at a cellular level and why most leaders don't realize it's happening until their performance is already slipping. Because if you understand what chronic stress is actually doing inside your brain, you will never look at mental fatigue the same way again. When stress hits your system, your hypothalamus activates the HPA axis, the stress response cascade that ultimately releases cortisol from the adrenal glands. Short term, this is adaptive. Cortisol mobilizes glucose, sharpens alertness, it increases blood pressure, and it prepares you for action. In an acute scenario, that's very useful. In a boardroom, in a negotiation, a crisis, it can sharpen you temporarily. But here's the problem. Most high performers are not experiencing acute stress. They're living in chronic activation. Emails never stop. Responsibility never stops. Financial pressure, leadership pressure, family pressure. Even when you're sitting still, your nervous system isn't. Cortisol stays elevated far longer than it should, and over time, that begins to rewire the brain. So let's start with the prefrontal cortex. This region governs executive function, impulse control, strategic reasoning, and long-term thinking. It's what separates a reactive manager from a visionary leader. Chronic cortisol exposure reduces synaptic density in the prefrontal cortex. Translation in simple terms, fewer connections, slower processing, reduced cognitive flexibility. You're still smart, you're still intelligent, but you're not as sharp. Okay, you're not as fluid, you're not as decisive. Now let's take a little bit of a closer look at the amygdala. This is your threat detection center. Chronic stress increases activity and even structural growth in the amygdala. So when the executive center weakens, the threat center strengthens. You become slightly more reactive, slightly more impatient, slightly more defensive. Over the years, that subtle shift compounds. And now let's add into that the hippocampus. This region of the brain handles memory consolidation and contextual thinking. Prolonged cortisol exposure has been shown to shrink hippocampal volume. And that's not motivational fluff, that is measurable neurobiology. So if you've noticed that recall isn't as effortless as it once was, that your mental endurance fades faster, that creative problem solving feels a little harder late in the day, that's not weakness. That is chronic stress physiology. And now, let's further layer dopamine dysfunction on top of everything else. Dopamine receptors downregulate when overstimulated. Caffeine spikes dopamine. Novelty spikes dopamine. High pressure decision cycles spike dopamine. Over time, the receptors become less sensitive. So the same stimulus produces less drive. You need more stimulation to feel the exact same amount of motivation. And this is why some executives start feeling really flat. They still show up, they still work, but the spark is dimmer. So they do what executives do. They compensate. More caffeine, more urgency, more artificial pressure. Those things do not fix receptor sensitivity. They accelerate the desensitization of it. So next up, let's talk glucose. The brain relies heavily on glucose delivery. Chronic stress and insulin resistance impair glucose utilization. You may have perfectly normal fasting glucose, but if your post-meal blood sugar spikes aggressively and then crashes 2 hours later, your brain feels it. That afternoon fog, that's unstable fuel. Your prefrontal cortex is extremely sensitive to fuel availability. If glucose delivery becomes erratic, executive function declines first. And this is why productivity hacks are bound to fail. You cannot schedule your way out of unstable fuel. Now, we'll add mitochondrial density to the conversation. Each neuron contains mitochondria, the organelles responsible for ATP production. Chronic inflammation, poor sleep, blood sugar swings, and hormonal shifts reduce mitochondrial efficiency. Less ATP equals less cellular energy. When your brain cells produce less energy, cognitive stamina declines. And again, not instantly, gradually and quietly. And this is why so many high performers say, I just don't seem to have the same mental endurance that I used to. They're absolutely right. But it's not mystical and it's not aging, it's biological. And then, on top of that, there's hormone signaling. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, thyroid hormones all influence neurotransmitter balance and cerebral metabolism. Declines don't just affect libido or muscle mass, they affect cognition. Testosterone supports dopamine tone. Estrogen supports synaptic plasticity. Thyroid hormone regulates metabolic rate. If those signals drift, cognition drifts with them. And this is why I call bullshit on simplistic solutions. Cold plunges are not going to fix receptor desensitization. A nootropic stack is not going to repair mitochondrial density. A new planner is not going to reverse hippocampal shrinkage. And corporate wellness seminars about mindfulness are not going to correct insulin resistance. If you want sustained mental sharpness in high-stress roles, you have to treat the brain as an energy-dependent organ embedded in a hormonal and metabolic ecosystem. That ecosystem can be optimized, or it can be eroded. And most executives are eroding it without realizing it. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to break down the 5 physiological pillars that determine whether your mental sharpness compounds with age or slowly declines. And I'm going to tell you exactly how to begin rebuilding them intelligently. So the question then is, how do we rebuild those pillars? Because if mental sharpness declines through systems, it can also be rebuilt through systems. There are 5 physiological pillars that determine whether your cognitive performance erodes under stress or strengthens with age. Hormone signaling, mitochondrial output, blood sugar stability, circadian rhythm alignment, and nervous system tone. Miss any one of those 5, the whole structure weakens. So let's start with hormonal signaling. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, thyroid hormones, these are not cosmetic hormones. They are signaling molecules that influence neurotransmitters, synaptic plasticity, glucose metabolism in the brain, and mitochondrial density. When testosterone declines, dopamine tone declines, drive softens, competitive edge dulls, and when estrogen declines in women, synaptic connectivity and neuroprotection drop. That's not emotional, that is neurochemical. When thyroid function drifts, even subclinically, cerebral metabolic rate drops. Brain cells literally produce less energy. Most leaders never test deeply enough to see this. They get a TSH and maybe total testosterone if you're a guy. That's it. That's like checking your fuel gauge and assuming the engine is fine. It just doesn't make sense. If you want sustained mental sharpness, you test free hormones, binding proteins, inflammatory markers, metabolic markers. You look at the whole signaling cascade, and then you correct what needs correcting, and you do it intelligently, not blindly, strategically. Okay, pillar 2. Let's talk about mitochondrial output. Your brain's performance is limited by ATP production. Period, end of story. If mitochondria are inefficient, your thinking slows. Chronic stress increases oxidative stress. Poor sleep impairs mitochondrial repair. Sedentary behavior reduces mitochondrial density, and excessive high-intensity training without recovery also damages them. This is why intelligent resistance training matters, not high volume burnout sessions. Low volume, high quality strength training increases mitochondrial biogenesis, improves insulin sensitivity, and enhances cerebral blood flow. At 54, I do not train like I did when I was 30. I train smarter, lower junk volume, strategic intensity, longer recovery, nervous system monitoring. And the result of all that is higher energy output, not less. Most executives are either undertraining or overtraining. Both impair mitochondria. Now, pillar 3, blood sugar stability. The executive brain cannot tolerate chaos in fuel delivery. If you spike glucose aggressively at lunch and crash 2 hours later, your prefrontal cortex goes offline. You feel foggy, irritable, impatient. That's not your personality. That's just unstable glucose metabolism. Stabilizing blood sugar means structured meals, adequate protein, controlled carbohydrate timing, and eliminating constant grazing. It also means improving insulin sensitivity through strength training and sleep regulation. You do not fix cognitive stamina without fixing metabolic stability. All right, next up, pillar 4, circadian rhythm. Cortisol has a rhythm. It should peak in the morning, taper gradually, and be low at night. Late night emails, screen exposure, alcohol, erratic sleep schedules, they all flatten that rhythm. And flattened rhythm equals flattened alertness. Your morning sharpness dulls, your evening recovery suffers. You cannot override circadian biology with discipline. You align it. Consistent wake times, morning light exposure, controlled evening light, strategic caffeine timing, and sleep window protection. This is all very foundational stuff. And finally, pillar 5, nervous system tone. Most executives live in sympathetic dominance, always on, always alert, always scanning. That state suppresses digestion, impairs recovery, elevates cortisol, and it desensitizes dopamine receptors. You cannot sustain elite cognition when you're in perpetual fight or flight. Parasympathetic recovery is not weakness, it is a performance strategy. Breath work, used correctly, low intensity movement, recovery walks, deliberate downregulation after intense cognitive blocks. These restore vagal tone. When vagal tone improves, HRV improves. When HRV improves, cognitive flexibility improves. And when cognitive flexibility improves, decision-making sharpens. This is not theory. Again, it is measurable physiology. And now here is where most people fail. They try and fix one of the 5 pillars. They supplement testosterone without fixing insulin resistance. They optimize sleep, but ignore blood sugar chaos. They meditate, but still train like a maniac. The system must be rebuilt as a system. And that is exactly why the assess method works. Analyze the full landscape. Stabilize blood sugar and nervous system tone. Support mitochondrial and hormone signaling, energize intelligently, stress regulate deliberately, and sustain the gains. Mental sharpness is not maintained by accident. It is engineered. So next up, I want to dismantle some of the habits that silently destroy cognitive longevity in high-stress leaders. Because before you rebuild elite mental sharpness, you have to stop degrading it. And most high performers are unknowingly running daily habits that erode cognition. So let's start with the big one. Chronic overcaffeination. I used to be the poster boy for caffeine all day, every day. And look, caffeine in and of itself is not evil. I'm not saying quit caffeine, but excessive reliance on it masks fatigue signals and accelerates dopamine receptor desensitization. You wake up tired. You spike caffeine. You override your natural cortisol rhythm. You create artificial alertness, and then you crash. So you spike it again. Over months and years, that rhythm flattens your natural energy curve. You don't feel wired, you feel dependent. And that dependency dulls sensitivity. The executive brain should not require pharmacological stimulation to function. It should have baseline energy. Okay, second destroyer. Late night cognitive load. Answering emails at 10:30 p.m., scrolling business news at midnight. Blue light exposure suppresses melatonin. Elevated cortisol at night impairs deep sleep architecture. And deep sleep is when glymphatic clearance happens. That glymphatic clearance is the brain's waste removal system. If you cut that short repeatedly, metabolic waste starts to accumulate. You wake up feeling mentally dull. Again, not because you're weak, but because you interrupted neuro repair. Okay, third destroyer. High-intensity training stacked on a high-intensity life. Personally, I love intensity. I get off on it. But you cannot redline your nervous system in the gym while redlining it in the boardroom and expect cognitive sharpness to improve. You can't. Excessive high-intensity interval training, junk volume, ego lifting, all while sleeping 6 hours and trying to run 3 businesses, that crushes recovery. Strength training should build resilience, not drain it. If your HRV is low, resting heart rate is elevated, and mood flat, your program's misaligned. Fourth destroyer. Blood sugar chaos disguised as healthy eating. Granola bars, low-fat yogurt, smoothies loaded with fruit, clean but carb-heavy lunches. Glucose spikes, insulin surges, and voila, reactive hypoglycemia. 2 hours later, you're foggy, irritable, and impatient. And you think you need more caffeine. No, you don't need more caffeine. You need stable fuel. Fifth destroyer, decision overload without recovery blocks. The brain fatigues with sustained executive function. If you stack high-stakes decisions back-to-back without parasympathetic downregulation, cognitive flexibility drops. You become rigid, short-tempered, less creative. Recovery is not laziness. It is a neural reset. And now we're going to have some fun because I'm going to take some shots at the biohacker circus. Stacking nootropics on top of sleep deprivation, microdosing while ignoring metabolic dysfunction, buying expensive devices without stabilizing blood sugar. That's ego optimization, not physiology optimization. You cannot out-supplement poor foundational regulation. And corporate wellness fluff, meditation apps while executives run on caffeine, alcohol, and 4 hours of sleep, that's cosmetic. Mental sharpness is built through metabolic and hormonal stability, not motivational slogans. Now here's the hard truth. If you feel less sharp than you did 10 years ago, it is rarely one catastrophic failure. It is an accumulation. Years of micro dysregulation, years of flattened cortisol rhythm and mild insulin resistance, subclinical thyroid risk, reduced mitochondrial density. None of this is dramatic. It is all cumulative. And the good news is, reversal, it works the same way. Layered correction and layered rebuilding. Not overnight hacks, systematic recalibration. And in the next segment, we're going to map out the rebuild protocol in detail, exactly how to restore mental sharpness without relying on stimulants or gimmicks. All of it using a structured, physiology-first approach that compounds your time. Because once you remove the destroyers, you don't just hope your cognition comes back. You engineer it. And this is where most executives get everything wrong. They wait for sharpness to return. It doesn't return. It must be rebuilt. And it must be rebuilt in the right order. Step number 1 is stabilization, not optimization. You stabilize blood sugar. 3 structured meals, high quality protein at each meal, controlled carbohydrates, no grazing, no constant snacking, and no 3 p.m. sugar hits disguised as clean snacks. When glucose stabilizes, insulin stabilizes. When insulin stabilizes, cerebral fuel delivery stabilizes. And within 2 or 3 weeks, most high performers noticed a greatly improved afternoon clarity. And that's not placebo, that's regulation. Next up, circadian correction. Consistent wake time. Morning light exposure within 10 minutes of waking. Caffeine delayed at least 60 to 90 minutes after waking so you don't blunt your natural cortisol rise. No late night emails in bed. Screens down an hour before sleep. This alone can dramatically improve your sleep architecture. Better clearance of the glymphatic system equals sharper mornings. And After that, we need to address mitochondrial output. 2 to 3 strength sessions per week. Low junk volume, high intent, full body emphasis, longer rest periods, no annihilation workouts here. You are not trying to burn calories. You are trying to build cellular energy systems. Strength training increases mitochondrial density. It improves insulin sensitivity, and it enhances cerebral blood flow. That combination goes a long way to restoring cognitive stamina. And now, let's layer in some low-intensity movement. Daily walking, zone-tuned cardio that's strategically placed. This improves oxidative capacity without overstressing the nervous system. And then we stress regulate intentionally. Breath work used as a tool, not as a trend. Slow nasal breathing, extended exhales. 5 minutes between intense work blocks. You shift from sympathetic dominance into parasympathetic recovery. HRV improves, cognitive flexibility improves. This is measurable. Now, hormones. With hormones, you do not guess. You test deeply. Free testosterone, free T3, reverse T3, SHBG, which is sex hormone blinding globule, estradiol, cortisol patterns, fasting insulin, inflammatory markers. You test all of these. And if there's a true deficiency, you address it correctly, not blindly. Hormone therapy is incredibly powerful when done intelligently. It is reckless when done casually. When signaling improves, neurotransmitter balance improves. When neurotransmitter balance improves, drive and clarity return. And this is why I am unapologetic about optimization. At 54, I do not accept cognitive decline as inevitable. I test, I adjust, I monitor. I train with intent. I recover with intent. I lead with clarity because I built the systems that support it. This is not ego. It is architecture. Mental sharpness is not preserved through motivation. It is preserved through physiology. The rebuild protocol is not sexy. It's structured. You analyze your current state. You stabilize fuel and sleep. Support hormonal and mitochondrial signaling. Energize through intelligent training. Stress regulate deliberately and intentionally, and sustain through consistent monitoring. That's the framework. When you apply it consistently, the fog will lift. I guarantee it. Decision speed improves, creativity returns, stamina extends. You stop feeling like you're compensating. You start feeling like you're in control again. And now I want to take just a quick minute to kind of tie this all together into the identity shift required to lead powerfully into your 50s and 60s and beyond. Because physiology gives you the platform, but identity will determine whether you sustain it. And here's the truth that most leaders won't say out loud. The fear is not fatigue. It's not brain fog. It isn't even performance dips. The fear is irrelevance. It's the quiet thought that maybe, just maybe, you've peaked, that maybe your sharpest years are behind you, that maybe younger, faster, more aggressive generations on their way up. That thought is dangerous. And not because it's true, but because if you accept it, your behavior changes. You start lowering your standards. You rationalize the cognitive drift. You tell yourself that, well, this is just what happens after 50. That narrative is poisonous. Decline is not mandatory. The leaders who stay sharp into their 60s and 70s are not lucky. They are deliberate. They treat cognition like capital. They protect it, they invest in it, and they measure it. They refuse to outsource it to coffee and chaos. And they absolutely do not accept the vague, oh, you're fine, lab reports as the final word. If you want to lead at high level for the next 20 years, your brain is the primary asset, not your calendar, not your CRM, not your assistant, your cognition, which means you need standards, non-negotiables. You need to protect your sleep window. You need structured training. You need disciplined nutrition. You need to monitor your stress load. You need labs evaluated by someone who understands signaling, not just reference reagents. And let me be blunt here. If you are still operating like a 35-year-old grinder at 52, you're not tough. You are undisciplined. And there is nothing alpha about ignoring recovery. There is nothing strong about redlining your nervous system indefinitely. That is ego. Strength at this stage is strategic. At 54, I can still train brutally hard. I can still think clearly under pressure, and I can still outwork most younger men. But I do it intelligently. My training volume is monitored. My sleep is protected. My fuel is structured. My hormones are optimized based on real data. The recovery is built in. That is not slowing down. That is sustaining dominance. The identity shift is this. You stop trying to prove that you can push harder, and you start proving you can last longer. That is executive maturity. That is physiological maturity, and that is what separates leaders who fade from leaders who compound. Because sharpness compounds when supported. It declines when it's assumed. Now here is the final layer. You do not need to feel broken to start this process. You do not need to wait until your focus collapses. You can decide right now that your brain is an asset worth protecting, that you will not accept mediocrity, that you will not outsource your energy to stimulants, and that you will not hide behind the aging narratives. You build the platform now, so the next decade can be stronger than the last decade. Now, we've covered a lot of ground up to this point, and now we're going to bring it full circle and talk about what sustained cognitive leadership actually looks like when physiology, identity, and recovery align, and how you move from maintaining sharpness to expanding. This is where everything converges, because sustained mental sharpness is not about hacks. It's about trajectory. Most leaders think in quarters, revenue targets, board meetings, product launches, but almost none think in cognitive decades. What does your brain look like at 60, at 65, at 70? Are you still decisive, still creative, still calm under pressure, or are you managing decline? The difference here is not eugenics, it's stewardship. If you rebuild and protect the 5 pillars we covered, hormone signaling, mitochondrial output, blood sugar stability, circadian alignment, nervous system tone, your cognition doesn't just stabilize. It actually strengthens. Because here's what most people don't understand. Neuroplasticity does not shut off magically at 40 years of age. Mitochondrial density can increase at 55. Insulin sensitivity can improve at 60. Hormone signaling can be optimized at any age when assessed correctly. Cognitive endurance can expand at any age. The brain remains adaptable if you remove chronic insult and start supplying consistent support. That's the real opportunity. Not just avoiding decline, but expanding capacity. Imagine leading with deeper experience and a fully optimized physiology. Strategic pattern recognition sharpened by decades of exposure, but paired with stable energy, clear recall, steady emotional regulation. That combination is lethal in the marketplace. Youth has speed, but mature physiology plus optimized systems has range. Range wins the long game. And here's the part that should actually excite you. When you stabilize blood sugar, your afternoon clarity improves. When you correct cortisol rhythm, your emotional reactivity drops. When you increase mitochondrial density, your mental stamina extends. When you optimize hormone signaling, drive returns without desperation. When you regulate nervous system tone, creativity expands. This is not theoretical. This is all observable. When those systems align, decision-making changes. You become less reactive, more strategic, less rushed, more precise. You do not chase urgency, you dictate pace. That is executive leverage, and leverage compounds. So let's talk about action. If you listen to this and recognize yourself in even one of these patterns, afternoon fog, dull drive, subtle decline in endurance, do not ignore it. Analyze. Don't guess. Get deep labs. Evaluate recovery markers. Assess HRV. Track your sleep architecture, stabilize fuel, correct rhythm, train intelligently, and then reassess. That is how leaders operate. Not emotionally, systematically. And if you want guidance through that process, that's what the 30-day Executive Energy Reset Blueprint was built for. You can get free access in the description. It gives you structure, it gives you the sequence, and then after that comes the stabilization phase. So you want to stop throwing effort at symptoms and start rebuilding the system that produces clarity. If you're serious about sustaining elite physical and mental sharpness in your 50s, 60s, and beyond, subscribe to the show. Share this episode with somebody who thinks productivity hacks are the answer. And if you're ready to go deeper, apply for coaching. Because the leaders who stay sharp, they don't leave it to chance. They engineer it. You've built businesses, you've built teams, you've built influence. Now, build a physiology that allows you to lead at full capacity for the next 20 years or more. Mental sharpness is not about luck. It's design. And the ones who design it dominate longer. I'll see you all very soon. Take care.